So this is Creation Confronts Contemporary Culture. Culturally, we no longer approach nature and humanity as God's creations. Consequently, our secular social reality ignores God, creation and creatureliness. We inhabit a non-creational life world and construct our laws, our knowledge, our power accordingly. Thus, we view our bodies as our own property. We assume all collective moral, legal and political frameworks are entirely our own constructions. We think of technology as something that is simply good because it enhances human power, and we view nature as a pool of resources that we can use however we choose. We are the creators of our own identities. We are the wielders of power over nature in whatever manner we determine. In this context, all classically Christian theologies of creation are at odds with our contemporary anti-creational culture. For the Christian sees God as the creator to whom we, as creatures, are accountable, and we see creation, including our own lives, as God's gifts to us, over which we have a sacred stewardship and good faith responsibilities. Hence, seeking to live out a Christian theology of creation is unavoidably dissonant with our non-creational way of life. And it's important to bear in mind that Western culture has only really abandoned an assumed theology of creation since about 1970. Whilst the conflict thesis is false, this does not mean that the impossible dissonance established in the 20th century between any public theology of creation and our now anti-creational academic culture has magically evaporated. A supposedly intrinsic and perpetual conflict between science and religion is indeed historically false propaganda, but this propaganda was produced by advocates of the late 19th century territorialisation of science and religion in order to deny the public authority of religion. By the 1970s, this denial was achieved and through modern scientism. Simply acknowledging the falsehood of the conflict thesis does not mean that all is now well between science and religion in this anti-creational, territorialisational situation. We must recognise that the very way in which the recent delineation of science from religion works is the ongoing mainstay supporting our anti-creational Western culture. Hence, any genuinely Christian theology of creation must oppose the assumed operational norms of our science and religion delineated culture if we are to remain faithful to Christ, who is the Logos of creation. John Betz's book, Christ, the Logos of Creation, points out that it is a basic teaching of the Christian faith that order and meaning in the cosmos are not illusions of our own consciousness, but they are divinely upheld realities. That is, the intelligible order, essential meaning, qualitative value, doxological purposes, and the traces of divine transcendence that are expressed everywhere in the cosmos are real, are in some degree knowable, and are all of one origin. That cosmologically unifying origin is Christ, the second person of the Trinity. The prologue to John's Gospel proclaims unequivocally that the Logos of God is the grounds of all natural and spiritual reality, and this Logos speaks to us at all times and in all places. Creation is not only the most basic truth of what the cosmos is, it is of central doxological importance. As the 24 elders in the Apocalypse of John put it, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honour and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." When a Christian theology of creation is assumed, nature is understood as a revelation of the divine Logos, and all creatures and the cosmos itself are in significant ways carriers of sacred meaning. Here, the natural order of creation is to be respected and worked with. The modern West is born assuming a Christian theology of nature, but the Enlightenment, it's a really bad word, by the way, the Enlightenment leads us to the separation of science from religion, which leads to the secularising of science and the privatising of religious belief. By the time the 20th century opens, knowledge itself is being firmly secularised. This process results in the collapse of any culturally assumed theology of creation by around 1970. Let us look at how this process happened. From the Enlightenment on, it has been an aim of modern philosophy to filter out the divine Logos from our understanding of nature. The Enlightenment vision of nature is held to be comprised of material objects whose behaviours we can observe and mathematically model, and whose properties we can deconstruct, manipulate, and technologically reconstruct as we please. Thus does the Enlightenment deliver to us the functionally materialist, methodologically atheist, and pragmatic life world which is advanced by scientific knowledge and technological power. This 18th century process will lead us to the present, where Western culture no longer assumes that nature is a creation, where we no longer assume that there is a creator, and where we do not assume that we are creatures. It is through Immanuel Kant that the modern picture of non-theological naturalism emerges. This is a whole new idea. Naturalism was never non-theological until the Enlightenment. Kant very effectively filters out the logos of creation from human knowledge, removing faith from knowledge under the supposed piety of making room for faith. Kant wants a pure reason and impure empiricism which is not dependent on any metaphysical speculation or any theological authority or any divine revelation. He gets this entirely human, transcendentally purified reason and rigorously empirical knowledge by dropping reality itself, and instead working only with reality as it appears to us, to the knowing human subject. That is, noumena, reality itself, is separated out from human reason and perception, and all knowledge becomes perspectival, anthropocentric, and a function of an exclusively human logical and sensory awareness. That's phenomena. Phenomena is the world as it appears to discretely human knowledge. Enlightenment phenomena is thus most effectively filtered from all metaphysical speculations about reality, from all transcendent mysteries, from all divine revelation, and definitely from scriptural and religious authority. Kant's late 18th century Logos filter, his famous Critique of Pure Reason, had a monumental influence on the Western mind. The Enlightenment was powerfully energised by Kant's brilliant marriage of continental rationalist deism with Scottish sceptical empiricism. This produced powerful streams within liberal German Protestantism, which delighted in the new humanist biblical scholarship and thrived on Kant's notion of faith within the bounds of reason alone. Religion is thus despoiled of its superstitious and non-scientific doctrines, then reduced to ethics, which is further reduced to a rationalist foundation of the golden rule. After that, faith is held to be an entirely personal matter of speculative belief and oceanic feelings directed towards an intangible supernatural something. Religion is thus separated out from knowledge and now has no connection to reason or orthodox doctrine or scientific truth or the practical realities of the world in which we live. Now, this doesn't happen before Kant. The early modernists are not like this. By the 1830s, Hegelian idealism and Kantian ethics in German Protestantism were constructing religion as a cultural enterprise that had increasingly little to do with sacred doctrine and creedal orthodoxy. In this climate, the bright young German theologian David Strauss puts forward his Life of Jesus critically examined. There is a lot going on in this highly influential text. There are two key developments here. Firstly, Strauss is entirely at ease with a pervasive rationalist scepticism about the historical accuracy of the Gospels. He has a total unbelief in anything miraculous. Secondly, he develops the idea of myth. Myth is a cultural construction of meaning that is not simply false, though it is factually false, but somehow the meaning of the myth is significant in a non-factual plane, and the religious is essentially about the mythic. Basically, Christian theology is turned into rationalist and empiricist anthropology, with the promise of a nascent psychological interest in mythic meaning as a way of understanding sub-rational human motivation. This trajectory is very quickly taken up in the 1840s by Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity is a key text in modern atheism. The argument is bracingly simple. Man makes God in his own image. Famously, Karl Marx found Feuerbach's work to be the decisive demonstration of atheism, as well as opening an entirely anthropological and political critique of religion. Religion thus becomes a means of manipulating the masses through fantasy stories about a non-existent afterlife in order to keep the masses subordinate to the power and wealth of the privileged elites. Religion is thus integral with unjust power and the exploitation of the many by the few. From the 18th century, the Enlightenment aims to separate faith from reason, theology from facts, miracles from history, metaphysics from knowledge. It is these separations that will produce the separation of science from religion in the latter half of the 19th century. There was no such separation in early modern science, for natural philosophy was then deeply integral with natural theology. Amos Funkenstein famously described early modern science as a secular Christian theology which was only brought to a decisive end by Kant. But intellectual ends take some time to play out in historical reality. As Peter Harrison chronicles it, it is not really until the late 19th century, around the 1870s, that science has defined its own discrete domain as firmly separated out from religion. Key features of this final separation are key figures in this final separation are Charles Darwin and Thomas Huxley. So Peter's book, The Territories of Science and Religion, is a fabulous read. You must all get it. Before the separation of science from religion in the late 19th century, young Charles Darwin was enthralled by William Paley's natural theology. Yet in his maturity, Darwin rejects Christian natural theology, and his work becomes a significant stimulus for the late 19th century separation of science from religion. The origin of species contributes strongly to the rise of 20th century scientific atheism. Having a naturalistic origins theory that could be used to replace traditional Christian conceptions of the creation of Adam and Eve was a significant step towards Western academia abandoning a Christian theology of creation. Darwin himself was conflict averse, did not wish to openly confront religious beliefs, and was of a reclusive habits. However, Darwin's longtime friend Thomas Huxley was anything but reclusive or conflict averse, and he saw the church as his direct rival in his progressive and reformist struggle. Huxley set out to culturally dethrone the clergy and to recreate England as a modern secular and scientific society. Huxley, branded Darwin's bulldog and Pope Huxley, was a powerhouse of political influence, public persuasion, and institutional and educational reform. His famous X Club and his many other society memberships were pathways to real influence in late 19th century England. By such influence, Huxley successfully created the profession of the modern scientist and promoted the secular epistemic authority of science at the expense of the clergy. He was at the heart of the late 19th century push to separate science from religion and to replace the public influence of religion with the public influence of science. In these endeavours, he was astonishingly successful. Whilst the conflict thesis as a transhistorical law is historically groundless and false propaganda, there actually was a very concrete conflict advocated by Huxley against religion in the name of science, and Huxley and his followers achieved genuine victory in that conflict. To pretend that such conflict did not happen in late Victorian England is simply false. By Huxley's death in 1895, a non-religious scientific positivism had gained an unassailable hold on the English Academy and in the Anglophone world. This trend was also expressed in the continent through the influence of liberal Protestants and romantic atheists as well. And most progressives were enamoured by advances in science and technology in a secular eschatological manner. Marx has got a completely secularised Christian eschatology. Huxley's own agnosticism and atheism of many of his close friends found numerous and influential champions in the earlier 20th century, such as Bertrand Russell. The conflict relationship between Christian theology and the authority of the clergy on one hand, and science and a quasi-religion of scientific scepticism on the other hand, deeply defines the 100 years from 1870 to 1970. This was the century in which the cultural authority of Christianity was overthrown in the West, and that authority was replaced by the epistemic authority of science. Many current contributors to the secularisation of the West in this period, as Charles Taylor's there are many currents contributing to the secularisation of the West, as Charles Taylor richly describes. Yet it is unavoidably the case that the separation of science from religion and the overthrow of Christian cultural assumptions via non- and often anti-religious scientific progressives in higher education and government are central to this astonishing cultural transformation of the West. Many Christians at this time were polarised as regards the conflict of science and religion. On the one hand, some Christians embraced science as the truth criteria for a credible Christian faith, often leading to abandoning core miraculous doctrine commitments, such as the resurrection of Christ. On the other hand, Christians embraced a fundamentalist rejection of liberal theology, rejected agnostic and atheistic scientism, rejected the secular naturalistic revolt against traditional morals, and rejected Darwinian evolution to boot. Outside of those polarities, there were quieter and less binary responses. However, in broad terms, progressive intellectual war of science against religion, that is, of science against religion, as fought in the universities from the 1870s, was decisively won by about the 1970s. Over the past half century, the cultural assumed authority of Christian doctrine has been firmly set aside from public life and consigned to private religious domains. The past 50 years has also seen the attempt to open up a new dialogue between science and Christian faith. Significantly, the context of this new dialogue is decisively after the collapse of the authority of Christian doctrine in Western culture. Thus, after 1970, the West has decisively lost any assumed Christian theology of creation. We now have an outline showing how the West lost its theology of creation. In 1950, at the University of Münster, the Catholic philosopher Josef Pieper delivered a lecture titled, "What Does Academic Mean?" This is a good 2 decades before the appearance in France of what we now call postmodernism, in an era where secular scientific positivism was the dominant outlook assumed in most Western philosophical circles. Pieper's argument is as simple as it is deep. Philosophy, he explains, is a truth-seeking enterprise that must be grounded in good faith in a divine source of the intelligible and ordered cosmos, and good faith in divinely enabled human epistemic illumination. Pieper traces this philosophical tradition from Plato's academy into the first Byzantine university and onto the founding of the West's great universities in high medievalism, through the modern era and to the present. Yet Plato and Pieper are very much aware that there is an ever-present rival tradition to philosophy in the West, and that tradition is sophistry. The sophist does not trust in the divine warrants that are required for truth-seeking and views words as ever-interested tools of power and knowledge as an entirely human construction. The struggle between philosophy and sophistry is perennial, and in the 1950s, Pieper is very concerned that the Western Academy, philosophy is on the brink of being overcome by sophistry. The point I wish to draw from Pieper is that Enlightenment frame scientific positivism is not and cannot be a truth-seeking enterprise. Positivism that sits within Enlightenment refusal of faith in the Creator is inescapably sophistic. Because such positivism does not trust in God for the truth warrants of our sensory and rational apprehension of creation, it must be anti-realist as regards science. So anti-realism is the only game in town in the philosophy of science at the moment, and anti-realism is that means that science doesn't give you a knowledge of reality, it gives you a knowledge of our knowledge of reality. That is, science is a human knowledge construction enterprise where our observations and theories are valuable to us because they are useful means of gaining power over the field of human activity and knowledge construction that we call nature. 20th century positivism sought to redefine truth as scientific fact construction and as the reliable manipulative control of nature, but as it sits within the Kantian rejection of metaphysics and theology, the only warranty for truth it has is the internal domain of human consciousness. Postmodernism develops naturally out of a creation-denying positivism, for the categories of internal knowledge construction are always defined by the contingencies of language, history, culture and power. Without any divine warrant for genuine metaphysical and transcendent truth, truth itself reduces to an everly contingent and culturally situated tool of power. Judith Butler illustrates this dynamic very clearly. One might think that the biological binary of male and female sex is a simple scientific fact about which there is no sensible controversy. Butler disagrees. Butler argues that nature and culture are inescapably co-constructive. And, as knowledge is a function of socially formed meanings, to quote, the social produces the biological, close quote. If we have no divine warrant for any human-independent, essential and intrinsically meaningful reality, her argument is inescapable. That is, sex is a human knowledge construction, as is nature. So if culture changes, so does our knowledge of nature. Hence, Butler argues that whilst the sex binary used to be a, quote, so-called fact of science, close quote, it is no longer. The cultural and political context of human knowledge and of normative performative meaning has changed, and we must now accept that human sex is a spectrum, it's a mosaic, and it is something that we construct with hormones, surgery, cultural performances, however we like. This is the postmodern, post-human triumph of sophistry over philosophy. It is the triumph of power and use over truth. It is the collapse of the notion of objective validity of empirically demonstrated scientific facts. Science in the West arises as a good faith enterprise in natural knowledge, where it is assumed that the Creator has made an intelligible and ordered cosmos where creatures have real natures that can to some degree be discerned to us by sense and reason. But the Enlightenment cuts the most foundational truth warrant of modern science off from its theological source. Consequently, science has no mooring beyond itself that can prevent it from turning into a merely pragmatic enterprise in power and politically situated meaning construction. The loss of creation theology in our culture also entails the loss of nature. Stuart Humphrey's fascinating book, The Aristotle Tradition of Natural Kinds and Its Demise, is a detailed exploration of a knowledge category that has been basic to Western biology ever since Aristotle first sought to undertake a systematic exploration of living things. This is the category of natural kinds. Natural kinds are distinctive from artificial or imaginative kinds in that their essential nature is real and independent of human interests and imagination. Aristotle maintained that even though only individual material creatures exist, there are different kinds of creatures, and individuals of the same kind share a real intellectual essence which defines the species to which they belong. I'm raising my eyebrows with every sentence because this is obvious, but somehow we don't understand this anymore. Aristotle is well aware that treating the natural world as intelligible and treating it as containing intelligible forms that define essential natural types, and treating these essences as independent of human knowledge and interest, is only achievable as an enterprise in good faith. It is an entirely reasonable good faith enterprise if, like Aristotle, one takes the common sense world of perceived natural reality as a window onto how real things essentially are. But such an enterprise falters, as Humphrey points out, when the good faith assumptions of the common sense outlook are not upheld. In other words, nature as an intelligible reality defined by real essential meanings disappears without faith in its divine origin. Without a creator, there is no creation. There is no intelligible cosmos, and there is no nature as a knowable domain that derives its essential meaning from beyond human cultural meanings. As a friend of mine, Michael Hamby, put it, no God, no science. He puts it with a question mark, but that's actually what his book means. That's just what you find in the end. Thus far, we have sketched an outline of how our culture lost its Western theology of creation and the manner in which this loss entails the loss of truth and the loss of nature. Let us now conclude with the third part of this presentation, which is a very brief sketch looking at how a contemporary Christian theology of creation cannot avoid clashing with the basic assumptions and practical norms of our non-creational culture. Historically, Christians are often bad at necessary confrontation. As we want to be, and want to be seen to be, kind, reasonable and respectable people. It's one thing I really like about the young earth creationists. They really don't care. There are all sorts of problems with young earth creationism, but they've got that bit right. Further, modern science arises out of early modern natural theology. So we feel that there is some terrible mistake if science is used as a tool against the theology of creation. But perhaps it is time to wonder if friendship with the anti-creational and intellectually respectable world is enmity with God. If a theology of creation is to confront the sophistry of our times, perhaps Christians need to stop adapting to the 19th century's separation of science from religion. Perhaps Christians need to stop adapting to the Enlightenment desire to purify reason and empirical evidence from faith. Perhaps Christians need to reconsider how effective a science-engaged theology can be when secular science now presupposes methodological atheism, functional materialism, and pragmatic anti-realism, and thus excludes any serious Christian theology of creation from the public domain. If we wish to have an at least partially true knowledge of natural reality, if we wish to maintain that there actually is an essential human nature, and that there are real moral and meaningful truths of wisdom that should be integral with scientific knowledge and technological power, then we may have to recognise that the dominant paradigm of what science is not workable. As I read the history of the relationship between science and religion from the 1870s to the present, Christians have largely let Thomas Huxley's post-Enlightenment science set the terms of all public truth claims. This has been a disaster. In the Protestant liberal trajectory, we have conceded that all historically embedded doctrines that presuppose the miraculous work of God are not in fact true. The supposed meaning of non-true miracle is taken out of factual reality and given a mythic or psychological or imaginative or ethical meaning. This is modern atheism in religious dress. Alternatively, Christians claim that science tells us factual truths about observable nature, but faith tells us meaningful reasons. Here we carefully delineate scientific territories of facts and demonstrated physical theories from the religious territory of non-factual, spiritual and moral meanings. When science steps into the domain of meaning and reason, this is scientism. When religion steps into the domain of facts and scientific theory, this is religionism. This is also the abandonment of the most central public truth claims of Christian theology of creation, that we and the world are God's creatures. If we are to confront our culture with a Christian theology of creation, which I've tried to do in that book, to quite mixed reception, I must say, we need to radically rethink what we mean by both science and religion. We need to drop Enlightenment philosophical assumptions and drop late 19th century definitions of science and religion. We're going to have to try and open up the hard box of what a Christian theology of science might look like in order to move forward. Thank you.